Thank you both so much. We welcome your comments or discussions. Would you come to the mics so that we can both hear you and the question can be recorded? We have a bit of time for that. And would you tell us to whom you're addressing your question? Not all at once, one at a time.
It's a question for Dr. Cavanaugh. I don't think you have to make a really complex theological argument to an American audience to say that the system is really whack. Having said that and hearing a critique, just curious to say, and this is obviously going to be very brief and not the right venue to unpack this. So what would a body politic, given our current, if you had a blank slate in front of you in America today to rewrite a constitution, what would it look like?
75 words or less.
Why don't you, instead of making me the founding fathers, why don't you just make me God and I'll start the creation over again? I got a few things to fix. Yeah, I mean, that's an unanswerable question to me, and it seems to me that the biblical writers had no assumption, as we do, that we in any meaningful way participate in earthly governance and can decide the way it's going to be. And I think the sooner we realize that we are in the same position as people were under when Paul wrote, the better we're going to be. I mean, we think, oh, we've gotten beyond that because now we live in a democracy and we can change all that if we want. But I really think that we're still peasants. We just don't, as Stanley has said, we're peasants who don't know we're peasants. And that's the problem. I mean, it's still the case that the elites rule over us, as Alistair McIntyre says, you know, the barbarians are not just at the gates, they've been ruling over us for quite some time. And it's always been the case that the elites rule over us and extract the resources they find necessary to do what they need to do or want to do from us. And the sooner we realize that that's the position that we're in. I mean, the problem with democracy, in other words, is that it has a way of sapping our ability to resist, because we think that if only we could just all get together and realize how whacked the system is, then we could change it, which really just doesn't explain why 50% of the population sits out the elections, because they're just not under any illusion that they actually can. So the rhetoric and the reality just don't match up. And so I think what we need to do is, you know, as McIntyre says, we're awaiting a kind of new Saint Benedict. I mean, what we need to do is kind of form kinds of communities in which that are, you know, in which full participation, call it democracy if you will, can actually take place. And you know, vote if you want to. But just don't put too much trust in it. But I think the way you phrase the question is precisely part of the problem, is that we think that we can make it all over again. And we've been convinced by our civics textbooks that that's what we can do. And I just don't think that that's in fact the case, which doesn't mean that it's a counsel for despair. It's a counsel instead for the kind of hopeful engagement on the level at which an actual difference can be made. But there's still plenty of room for shaking your fist at the larger powers that be, but just don't think that because the Democrats got elected, the kingdom of God is just around the corner. You know, it's, you know, President Obama just signed the Monsanto Protection Act into law on Thursday, and in the face of 250,000 signatures asking him not to do this. But it's a new law protecting the Monsanto Corporation from lawsuits and from the government in addition. And if anybody has seen the movie Food Incorporated, Monsanto Corporation is busily suing everyone, small farmers for saving their own seeds. But now they're protected from lawsuits. So anyway.
This is for Professor Cavanaugh. For younger generations, it's pretty easy to be cynical about sort of our bipartisan politics, and even the question of whether to vote at all or not, whether to look into third parties. How much energy should we really put into sort of thinking through third parties, or sort of refining and reforming whatever party as Christians, or should we put our efforts elsewhere?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a place for envisioning different kinds of engagement with party politics. I do. I just think that that tends to be the basket into which we put all of our eggs. And I just think that we need to start thinking more creatively. I mean, the kind of work that Jana is doing, for example, let's start thinking about different things to do with our family life that enact, I mean, when we expand the definition of politics to include families and things that are usually excluded from that definition, we're liberated to think in new ways and to do something that's actually life-giving and not just frustrating. I mean, you could start a third party and in a two-party system never make any, I mean, you could live your whole life out and never get more than 5% of the vote. But when you talk about the kinds of communities that Jana was talking about, there's a real sense of hope and a real sense that the kingdom of God is in our midst. Do you want to, Jana? Do you want to?
I mean, I think that voting in our current structure is. I think the two-party system is idolatrous, and I think that the way that we end up being forced to choose between the different kind of goods that the political parties have on offer, which I think, as Bill has rightly pointed out, are mandated by the elite, by elites, is a real problem. And I think you're right to raise that question. It's certainly one that I struggle with. Is should I be voting at all? Should I be voting third party? I think go ahead and vote. I just think that it's not going to be the thing that we tend to chalk it up as. I mean, it's not going to do all the things that the rhetoric suggests a vote will do. I think voting. Go ahead and vote, but it's not the be all and end all of political participation. Yeah.
My old farmer grandpa used to say about the nutritional quality of pickles, he said, you can eat them or you can throw them out the window, and you get pretty much the same nutritional benefit. And that's pretty much the way I think about voting.
I'm almost tempted to say that there is though I'm here only to direct traffic, that there's a third alternative, which is to go indeed and vote for no one as a protest vote, which we have a right to, but we don't use. Anyway, one more from this side, and then we'll go to this side.
Okay. This is also for Dr. Cavanaugh. And Jana, I just want to say, lest you feel neglected, that I personally found the best response to your talk was repentance and conversion. So, so for Dr. Cavanaugh, as you probably know, there's a lot of folks who are arguing, particularly people associated with the Acton Institute, for instance, that there's and this I think is lying behind the Michael Novak thing that you were quoting, that there's a kind of gift of economic creativity that is expressed through the entrepreneurial spirit and so on, and that we sort of academic eggheads, tend to be left-wingers because we don't understand that. We just want to sit around and, read books and whatever, and maybe we're even kind of lazy and, we don't understand these busy people going out serving God by starting businesses. And I just wondered if you would articulate how far you think that's valid and what would be the place of someone who felt that kind of calling. You talked about doing business in an economy of love, but a little bit more on how that might be valid and how the church might encourage entrepreneurial gifts in legitimate ways.
Yeah, excellent question. It's easy to throw rocks, and that's why I included that part at the end about businesses. And in my book, Being Consumed, I give concrete examples of businesses that are run in ways that are very consonant with this Christian idea of an economy of love. I mean, the problem with the ideas of the Acton Institute and folks like that is that there's a certain kind of Pelagianism about this kind of me as co-creator with God, and there's no Christology to it. It's just this kind of immediate, the individual as a co-creator with God, and therefore we need to thank them for being the job creators, right? That's one of my favorite euphemisms now. We don't call them rich people anymore. We call them job creators, right? And so we need to, bow down to the job creators. But there are things like, the Mondragon Corporation, probably an example that's been overdone, but a $6 billion corporation in Spain that was founded by a Basque priest who had been influenced by distributist ideas, Chesterton and Belloc and people like that, and started what's now a very large corporation, but it's run on cooperative principles. The highest paid person can only make 7 times what the lowest paid person makes, as opposed to hundreds of times disparity in most corporations. And decision-making is shared, and profits, most importantly, the workers own a share of the profits, so the workers are also shareholders. It's been an incredibly successful and satisfying model, and I just don't see why Christians can't start businesses like that. I don't think there's any reason, and I don't think why that's at all a limit on entrepreneurialism. I mean, you sometimes get the argument that in order to really incentivize entrepreneurialism, you have to allow people to make billions of dollars. And if that's the case, then we just need to call it what it is, which is greed, right? It's an old-fashioned Christian vice,
There seemed to be a despair about, in both of you speakers, I heard only the last one, about voting having any effect on how the government will act towards us, the peasants. And I think I really appreciate that. I really admire your pessimism. But I think it was Franklin who was asked to define democracy and freedom. And Franklin said, well, democracy, he said, is 2 wolves and a sheep talking over what we're going to have for dinner. And freedom is 2 wolves and an armed sheep talking over what we're going to have for dinner. Now, I think our founding fathers made a very bad decision to eliminate what was called bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is a bill that's directed at one man. It can be directed. The plea was, please don't eliminate bills of attainder, because they can be used by legislatures to contain towering criminals. Well, we're looking at towering criminals today, corporations. But the trouble with bills of attainders and why the founding fathers eliminated them was because they're too threatening to liberty. It means the legislature can say, you ride your bicycle wrong, flack. and that can be Congress. So Congress can come down and crush me. But if I'm armed to punish Congress, and if I can gather people of like-minded to march on Congress and destroy Congress, as Patrick Henry insisted. He insisted if you adopt the present Constitution, he said...
Since we're running low on time, can you...
Let me finish 1 second.
Yeah.
You will have not one musket in the state of Virginia with which to punish Congress. Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question was. Okay, thank you. Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think we shouldn't arm ourselves. Despair would be better than arming ourselves.
Thank you.
How can you despair?
We can carry this in private afterwards. Thank you. Yeah.
You bring up the concept of representation. Sorry. Representation is very important for our notion of having been made in the image of God. And also our democracy is founded upon that concept as well, representation. So I guess in the Bible, we have an image of top-down representation. Whereas in the United States, we're going to assume that we can have some sort of bottom-up representation. I don't know if it's for either of you, which question, who should answer it, but do you think we are only able to have top-down representation, or are we able to attain some sort of bottom-up representation with which to actually form democracy?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by top-down?
Yeah, so top-down representation, God is what he is, and we are what we are because of what God is. Whereas with bottom-up, it would be we are what we are, and our representative we send to Congress or whatever is because of what we are or what we think. Maybe that's too abstract.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's abstract. I mean, the irony, I think, is that top-down representation in terms of the image of God equalizes all of us because we're all equally made in the image of God, and therefore we participate not only in God, but through our participation in God, we participate in one another. And so there's a certain sense in which it's much more kind of bottom-up, precisely because it's top-down, whereas early theories of representation in terms of democratic representation assumed that you couldn't have the demos truly represented in the political system because they neither had the leisure to participate themselves nor hire someone to represent them. And so I think in some ways that's also true, that what you get when you get a modern system of representation is a representation of interests and not a representation of any kind of common good or common whole. That would be my attempt to answer that.
I guess I could add to that I think that there's that's one of the great myths of American society. I think is that we think that this is about each individual person being represented in a democracy, and that's the way that this is fundamentally how this works, and this is fundamentally good. And I am very suspicious of the ways in which I am not represented by the various entities that make up not just the government, but all kinds of groups that function in society. And so I would tend to agree with Bill that I'm not sure how much of a bottom-up thing we've got going in contemporary culture.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, this is for Dr. Powers. I really appreciate how you started with the birth of Christ in describing his sonship to Joseph and Mary rather than starting at creation with the family. But I'd like to ask if you, how much you've studied or would consider Jesus' life as the Son of the Father in the Spirit, and his sonship being bestowed upon others at Pentecost and following, for Christians being sons of God, and then how would that impact the church's view of not only marriage but of gender identity and singleness?
So are you asking, like, when we start with the perspective of
The Trinity.
of the Trinity,
But Jesus' life, not from the
not from creation?
well, and not from the immanent Trinity, but from the economic Trinity, and others being put into the life of Christ by the Spirit, so that the Christian life is a Trinitarian life. But then how does that impact then Christian identity in marriage, gender, and
Right.
our lives together as brothers and sisters in the family of Christ?
Right, yeah. So I think, I mean, there is a group of theologians that have done this work, this kind of thing, that have tried to articulate marriage and family in relation to the eminent, the economic Trinity. Do I mean the economic Trinity? I don't remember my seminary word, but there are theologians who have very clearly tried to articulate a Trinitarian understanding of marriage and family. People like Hans von Balthasar. It has a very strong current in Catholic theology of marriage with John Paul II and with and with Angelo Cardinal Scola and others. It looks very. It has a very interesting take on family that I think the popular version of it gets made into something like the husband equals the father, the wife equals Jesus, and the two of them generate the Spirit. I don't really think that's what the theologians themselves are talking about, but I think it gets very problematic to talk about Trinity, to talk about family for precisely that reason, because it ends up, I think, again, going towards an idolization of family, but this time in the name of trying to represent God in a way that I think humans can't do. And so I mean, I think that there's some important articulation there, but I worry about, that would be my worry about beginning with Trinity to talk about family. If we're thinking about Trinity in terms of the relationship that all of us humans have in, through the Son and the Holy Spirit in relation to the church, then I think there's much more to go on in terms of being married and single. And then I think that married family witness and the witness of several states of singleness, I think that's a much more rightly ordered kind of view.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Let us take one last question since our time is coming.
Hi. I guess this is for either one of you, really, but I was wondering if you could talk to the role of education and its limits as it relates to the individual, corporate, charity, justice, private, public, those sort of, that dialectic. I could say more, but I don't want to lead the witness too much about what I have in mind.
Say some more.
Okay. Well, the most immediate thing, I guess, that came to mind that prompted it was homeschooling and how it relates to development of the family as Christians and our Christian responsibility to educate and train our children, what it is, what it isn't. And as educators, my wife's a Chicago Public School elementary school teacher, and so I'm sort of watching from afar. The struggle of, as an educator to children, the role of your Christian witness and your Christian identity, how much is too much to bring into the classroom, and how does that inform our practice? Is that helpful or too much?
I mean, my kids go to Catholic schools, and that was a way that Catholics, one of the ways that Catholics carved out position as a kind of tertium quid in American society, they discovered that public schools were really Protestant schools in the 19th century. And so they started their own school system. And it's functioned in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that it functioned, I think, is to keep a certain sort of ecclesial sense alive in a way that they might think of themselves as not just either private or public, but as Catholic. In my hometown, St. Charles, Illinois, there were two religions. There were Catholics and there were publics. And that was, I mean, so the school system, in other words, was an important part of an ecclesial kind of identity. I mean, that's, in a lot of ways, that's faded as Catholic churches have entered the kind of educational marketplace and now sell themselves on the basis of, you know, high academic achievement and getting your kids into a good, you know, high school, college, and values. We have values, right? Well, who doesn't have values, right? The questions are what kind? But anyway, Jana, why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you ask this question because I am at the moment, my husband and I are at the moment trying to figure out what to do for kindergarten for our 5-year-old, and so very much personally involved in this debate. And there's all kinds of things that go into this, from the fact that we live in an urban public school district that is extremely poor. You know, 90% of the kids there qualify for Title I free school lunches, and on the other hand, the Catholic schools are what public school was for me when I was growing up, which are kind of standard. You know, religion is a sort of nice little thing in the Catholic schools in our area where you learn about peace and love and values, because, you know, but there's not, as far as I can tell, a whole lot of learning about Christ. And I think there's a lot of reasons why, I mean, and there's an increasing number of people who have not necessarily any sort of religious background, deciding they want to homeschool because they just feel like there's no, I mean, where do you go? That this is where you've got to go. I mean, I think there's a couple of encouraging things that I think about that. One is, I think homeschool associations are making homeschooling much less of an individual choice, which would be one of my concerns about it. And I think that there's a kind of sincere desire to make that much more ecclesial, which I think is important. That said, I still worry about, you know, what's going on, for instance, in my school district for children who are severely impoverished, whose parents have like no hope of even finding jobs that would bring them out of that poverty, and how we end up being responsible for that. So that if I was going to make a choice to homeschool, I'd still want to figure out some way of being involved with and engaged with that part of the community that, you know, otherwise gets lost. So I can't just make the homeschooling choice just because, you know, I'm worried about my kids. I think that would be my concern there. I would say, I'm about to write a blog post on this, and one of the things I would articulate about it is I think that this is one of those many things that I would identify as a wicked problem, which my colleague Brad Kallenberg at Dayton uses to discuss moral problems. He says wicked problems are things that have no clearly defined solution, that the way you tell the story about them changes the way that you understand the outcome. Where you begin in terms of solving the problem dictates how you understand the rest of the problem. And I think U.S. education, broadly speaking, is one of those. And I think that the best we can do is to keep trying to not make homeschooling an individual thing, not making school choice at all an individual thing, but think about all the different ways in which we might be trying to relate to children in a variety of ways that would bring them, that would articulate a corporate nature rather than our individual choices.
Thank you. Would you thank our presenters with me?